Marcus Thompson had always been a patient man, but today was different. The scorching July sun beat down mercilessly on the crowded streets of London as he pushed his baby stroller through the thick crowds gathering around Buckingham Palace. His 6-month-old daughter Emma was crying inconsolably, her tiny face red and sweaty from the heat. The diaper bag felt heavier with each step, and his wife Sarah walked beside him, clearly exhausted from their long journey from Manchester. They had planned this trip for months. Sarah's sister was getting married in London, and they thought it would be perfect to combine the family celebration with a little sightseeing. Marcus had promised Emma her first glimpse of the famous royal guards, imagining the wonder in her eyes when she saw the tall figures in their iconic red uniforms and bearskin hats. What he hadn't expected was the massive crowd that had gathered for an impromptu royal appearance. The narrow sidewalk was packed shoulder to shoulder with tourists, street vendors, and locals, all trying to get a better view of the palace gates. Marcus found himself constantly apologizing as he tried to navigate the stroller through the sea of people. Someone stepped on his foot, another person knocked into Sarah, and a group of teenagers pushed past them without any consideration for the crying baby. Emma's wails grew louder, echoing off the surrounding buildings. Marcus could feel the stares from other tourists, some sympathetic, others clearly annoyed by the disruption. He tried everything he could think of, rocking the stroller, offering Emma her pacifier, even singing softly to her, but nothing seemed to work. The heat, the noise, and the overwhelming crowd were too much for the little one. Sarah touched his arm gently. "Maybe we should find somewhere quiet," she suggested, but Marcus shook his head stubbornly. They had come all this way, spent their savings on this trip, and he was determined to give his daughter the experience he had promised. He had grown up poor, never having the chance to travel or see famous landmarks as a child, and he wanted Emma to have everything he had missed. As they slowly made their way closer to the palace gates, Marcus noticed a small opening in the crowd near the guard post. One of the Queen's guards stood perfectly still, his red uniform immaculate despite the heat, his expression hidden beneath the shadow of his tall black hat. Marcus thought this would be the perfect spot for a photo. Emma, in her stroller with the magnificent guard in the background. He carefully maneuvered the stroller toward the clearing, but just as he positioned it for the perfect angle, a group of tourists rushed in from behind. The sudden surge of people caught Marcus off balance. He stumbled forward, accidentally bumping the stroller into the metal barriers that separated the public from the guard area. The collision wasn't hard, but it was enough to startle Emma even more. Her crying reached a new level of intensity, and Marcus felt his patience finally snap. The combination of the heat, the stress of traveling with a baby, the money he had spent, and the disappointment of the ruined moment all crashed down on him at once. A security officer approached them, speaking in a stern voice about maintaining proper distance from the barriers. Marcus tried to explain that it was an accident, that he was just trying to get a photo, but the officer seemed more interested in moving them along than listening. Other tourists were staring now, some taking out their phones to record the scene. Marcus felt humiliated. Here he was, a hardworking father who had saved up for months to give his family a special experience, being treated like some kind of troublemaker. The injustice of it all burned in his chest. He had followed all the rules, paid for parking, bought overpriced souvenirs, and tried to be respectful, but nothing was going right. The royal guard remained motionless through it all, as he was trained to do. These guards were famous for their discipline, their ability to remain perfectly still and expressionless, no matter what happened around them. Tourists often tried to make them laugh, wave, or react in some way, but they were professionals who took their duty seriously. But Marcus wasn't trying to get a reaction from the guard. He was just a frustrated father at his breaking point. As the security officer continued to lecture him about proper protocol, and Emma's crying reached a fever pitch, Marcus felt something inside him snap. Without thinking clearly, acting purely on emotion and exhaustion, he grabbed the handle of the stroller with both hands. The crowd seemed to sense that something was about to happen. Conversations died down, and even Emma's crying seemed to pause for a moment. Marcus lifted the stroller slightly off the ground, his muscles tense with frustration and anger. Sarah called his name, reaching out to stop him, but she was too far away and caught behind other tourists. In that moment, Marcus wasn't thinking about consequences or what might happen next. He wasn't considering that dozens of people were watching, or that this was one of the most secure locations in London. All he could think about was his disappointment, his exhaustion, and his feeling that nothing was going according to plan. The royal guard, despite his training to remain motionless, couldn't help but notice the commotion. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the frustrated father, the crying baby, in the tense situation developing just a few feet away from his post. Years of training had taught him to expect the unexpected, but this was certainly not a scenario covered in any manual. Marcus raised the stroller higher, his face red with anger and frustration. The metal frame caught the sunlight, and for a split second, time seemed frozen. The tourists, the security officer, Sarah, even little Emma, everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. What happened in that moment would surprise everyone present, including Marcus himself. But sometimes, The most unexpected situations bring out the most extraordinary responses from ordinary people. The Royal Guard, trained to be a symbol of unwavering duty and discipline, was about to make a decision that would change not just that afternoon, but the lives of everyone involved in ways they never could have imagined. The stroller left Marcus's hands with more force than he had intended. What started as a gesture of pure frustration became something much more serious as the lightweight aluminum frame flew through the air toward the Royal Guard's position. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people screamed as they realized what was happening. Guard Lieutenant James Mitchell had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours. At 28 years old, he had served with the Queen's Guard for 6 years and thought he had seen everything. Tourists trying to make him laugh, protesters attempting to get reactions, even the occasional drunk person getting too close. But nothing had prepared him for a baby stroller being hurled in his direction. His training kicked in immediately. Despite the strict protocol requiring him to remain motionless, Mitchell's protective instincts took over. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward and caught the stroller with both hands, his quick reflexes preventing what could have been a dangerous situation. The crowd fell silent, shocked by the guard's sudden movement and the grace with which he had handled the crisis. But what happened next surprised everyone even more. Instead of immediately calling for backup or having Marcus arrested, Lieutenant Mitchell looked down at the stroller he was holding. Inside, little Emma had stopped crying, her wide blue eyes staring up at the tall figure in the red uniform. For just a moment, the trained soldier's stern expression softened as he looked at the innocent child. Caught in the middle of her father's outburst, Marcus stood frozen, immediately realizing the gravity of what he had done. He had just thrown a stroller at one of the most elite guards in the British military, in front of dozens of witnesses, at one of the most secure locations in London. His anger vanished instantly, replaced by horror and the sick understanding that he had probably just ruined his life. Sarah pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her husband. "Marcus, what have you done?" she whispered, but her voice was lost in the chaos around them. Security officers were already moving in from multiple directions, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Lieutenant Mitchell found himself in an unprecedented situation. His training told him to maintain his position and let security handle the incident. But something about the scene before him gave him pause. He could see that Marcus wasn't a threat or a terrorist. He was just an overwhelmed father who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of frustration. The guard gently rocked the stroller, and amazingly, Emma began to calm down. Her crying subsided to soft whimpers, and she seemed fascinated by the tall man in the impressive uniform. Mitchell had grown up with 3 younger sisters and had always been good with children. Though his current role rarely gave him opportunities to show that side of himself, Marcus slowly approached, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender and apology. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what came over me. I would never hurt anyone. We've been traveling all day, and she's been crying, and I lost my temper. I'm so incredibly sorry." The security officers reached them, their hands moving toward their equipment. But Lieutenant Mitchell held up one hand in a subtle gesture that made them pause. He was still holding the stroller with his other arm, and Emma had now completely stopped crying, seemingly mesmerized by the bright buttons and decorations on his uniform. "Sir Mitchell," said formally to Marcus, his voice carrying authority but not anger, "what you've just done is a serious matter. However, I can see that you're not a threat, and your daughter appears to be unharmed." He paused, looking down at Emma, who was now reaching her tiny hands toward the shiny buckles on his uniform. "May I ask what led to this situation?" The crowd pressed closer, everyone straining to hear the conversation. Phones were recording from multiple angles, and several news reporters who had been covering the royal event began to take notice of the unfolding drama. Marcus could feel the weight of all those eyes on him, but the guard's calm demeanor gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, this situation wasn't completely hopeless. "We came down from Manchester for my sister-in-law's wedding," Marcus explained, his words tumbling out quickly. "I wanted Emma to see the guards, to have her picture taken here. We saved up for months for this trip, but everything went wrong. The crowds, the heat, she wouldn't stop crying, and I snapped. I've never done anything like this before in my life. I work in construction, I have no criminal record, I'm not a violent person. I just wanted to give my daughter a nice memory." Lieutenant Mitchell listened carefully, and something in Marcus's voice rang true. The guard had developed a good sense for reading people during his years of service, and he could tell the difference between someone with malicious intent and someone who had simply reached their breaking point. Emma chose that moment to let out a little giggle, apparently delighted by the reflection she could see in one of the guard's polished buttons. The sound cut through the tension like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Several people in the crowd smiled despite themselves, and even some of the security officers seemed to relax slightly. "What's her name?" Mitchell asked, still maintaining his formal tone but with a hint of warmth creeping in. "Emma," Marcus replied, surprised by the question. "Emma Rose Thompson. She's 6 months old today, actually. That's part of why we wanted to come here, to celebrate her half-birthday somewhere special." Mitchell looked down at the baby, who was now trying to grab onto his uniform with her small fingers. Despite everything that had just happened, she seemed completely comfortable in his presence. The guard made a decision that would go against every protocol he had been taught, but felt absolutely right in that moment. "Happy half-birthday, Emma," he said quietly, and then he began to slowly walk back toward his post, still carrying the stroller. The crowd parted before him, everyone watching in amazement as this elite soldier, trained to be emotionless and unmovable, gently cared for the baby whose father had just committed what should have been a serious offense. The security officers looked at each other uncertainly. This was definitely not in any of their training manuals either. Marcus and Sarah followed nervously, unsure what was happening but afraid to speak or move too quickly. The entire situation had taken on a surreal quality, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Lieutenant Mitchell reached his designated post and did something that had never been done in the history of the Queen's Guard. Instead of resuming his rigid stance, he carefully positioned the stroller beside him and remained standing next to it, one hand resting protectively on the handle. Emma looked up at him with complete trust, her earlier distress completely forgotten. The crowd began to murmur in amazement. Many of them had cameras and phones out, documenting this unprecedented break-in protocol. A royal guard was not only interacting with the public, but he was actively caring for a baby whose father had just committed what should have been a criminal act. The scene was so unexpected, so contrary to everything people knew about these stoic soldiers, that many couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Marcus stood about 10 feet away, still in shock. Sarah had reached his side and was holding on to his arm, both of them afraid to move or speak. The security officers maintained their positions but seemed equally uncertain about how to proceed. Clearly, Lieutenant Mitchell was taking control of the situation in his own way, and his calm authority was keeping everyone else calm as well. "Mr. Thompson," Mitchell said, using Marcus's surname though he had never given it. The guard had sharp observational skills and had noticed the name embroidered on Marcus's work shirt. "I want you to understand that what you did was unacceptable and could have had serious consequences. However, I can see that you're a father who loves his daughter and made a mistake in a moment of extreme stress." Marcus nodded vigorously, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I know what I did was wrong. I'll accept whatever punishment is necessary. I hope you understand I would never actually hurt anyone. I was just so frustrated and tired." Lieutenant Mitchell looked down at Emma, who was now contentedly playing with a small toy attached to her stroller. The baby's calm demeanor spoke volumes about the kind of home she came from. Children who are loved and cared for don't typically exhibit fear or anxiety around strangers, and Emma's comfort with the situation suggested she was used to being in safe, loving environments. "Tell me about your work, Mr. Thompson," Mitchell said unexpectedly. Marcus was confused by the question but answered honestly. "I'm a construction worker, sir. I build homes, mostly. I've been doing it for 12 years. Worked my way up from apprentice to site supervisor. We don't make a lot of money, but it's honest work, and I'm proud of it. In this trip to London, we saved up for 8 months. Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus worked overtime every week, and I took on extra shifts at the hospital where I work as a nurse. We wanted Emma to have experiences we never had as children. We thought this would be special for her." Lieutenant Mitchell nodded slowly. He came from a working-class family himself and understood the sacrifice involved in a trip like this. His own parents had worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and he knew how precious and rare these opportunities could be for families like the Thompsons. A small crowd of onlookers had now gathered specifically to watch this unusual interaction. Word was spreading quickly through the area that something extraordinary was happening at the guard post. Several tourists were sharing the videos they had taken on social media, and the footage was already beginning to go viral. One of the senior security officers approached Lieutenant Mitchell. "Lieutenant, we need to discuss how to handle this situation," he said quietly. Mitchell looked at him steadily. "Officer Davies, I understand your concerns, but I believe this situation is under control. Mr. Thompson has shown genuine remorse for his actions, and there's no indication of any ongoing threat or malicious intent." Emma chose that moment to reach up toward Lieutenant Mitchell's face, her tiny fingers trying to touch the shiny buttons on his uniform jacket. Without hesitation, the guard leaned down slightly so she could reach them, and she giggled with delight as she tapped the polished metal. The crowd collectively sighed at the sweetness of the moment. Here was this imposing figure, trained for combat and ceremony, being completely charmed by a 6-month-old baby. Several people in the crowd began to smile, and the hostile atmosphere that had existed just minutes earlier was rapidly dissolving into something much warmer. Lieutenant Officer Davies pressed. "There are protocols we need to follow." Mitchell straightened up but kept his hand on the stroller. "Officer Davies, I've been thinking about those protocols." Mr. Thompson made a serious error in judgment, but the result was that he inadvertently delivered his daughter directly into the protection of the Queen's Guard. Perhaps we could consider that his actions, while misguided, ultimately demonstrated his trust in our ability to keep his child safe. It was a creative interpretation of events, but it wasn't entirely wrong. Marcus had thrown the stroller toward a guard, and the guard had indeed caught it and was now protecting Emma. The crowd began to nod in agreement with this perspective, and several people called out supportive comments. "That's right," shouted an elderly woman with a Yorkshire accent. "The man just wanted his baby to meet the guard. He didn't mean any harm," added a young man with a camera. "Look how happy the little one is." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. The crowd that had been hostile just minutes earlier was now defending him. But more importantly, this royal guard, this symbol of British tradition and authority, was showing more compassion and understanding than he had any right to expect. Lieutenant Mitchell looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly. If you could do this moment over again, what would you do differently?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I would have asked for help, sir. I would have found a security officer and explained that my baby was upset and asked if there was somewhere quiet we could go. I would have remembered that my frustration wasn't anyone else's fault, especially not Emma's. I would have been the father she deserves, not the angry man I became." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah squeezed his arm proudly, and even Officer Davies seemed moved by the response. Lieutenant Mitchell made his decision. What he did next would not only change the course of that afternoon, but would become a story that people would tell for years to come. A reminder that sometimes humanity and compassion matter more than rules and protocols. Lieutenant Mitchell reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out something that surprised everyone watching. A small, official-looking certificate. It was blank, the kind used for special commendations within the military, though no one in the crowd knew that. With careful handwriting, he began to fill it out while still standing beside Emma's stroller. "What I'm doing," he announced clearly so the growing crowd could hear, "is issuing an official document. This certificate states that Emma Rose Thompson, age 6 months, has been personally welcomed to London by the Queen's Guard, and has demonstrated exceptional bravery in the face of a challenging situation." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. What had started as a potentially criminal incident was being transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Marcus stared in disbelief as the guard carefully wrote Emma's name in elegant script, along with the date and location, but Lieutenant Mitchell wasn't finished. He looked up at Marcus with an expression that was both serious and kind. "Mr. Thompson, I'm also going to ask something of you. I want you to promise me that you'll remember this moment not as the day you lost your temper, but as the day you learned that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness." Marcus nodded vigorously, his voice choked with emotion. "I promise, sir. I'll never forget this lesson, or your kindness." The guard then did something that made the entire crowd gasp in wonder. He carefully removed one of the polished buttons from his uniform jacket, a serious breach of protocol that could normally result in disciplinary action. These buttons were part of the sacred uniform, each one maintained to perfection and representing centuries of military tradition. "This button," Lieutenant Mitchell explained, as he cleaned it on his white gloves, "has stood guard at Buckingham Palace for over 300 days. It has witnessed royal ceremonies, state visits, and countless historic moments. I want Emma to have it as a reminder that she, too, has been part of history today." He attached the button to a small ribbon and carefully tied it to Emma's stroller. The baby immediately reached for the shiny object, fascinated by how it caught the light. Her delighted giggle rang out across the courtyard, and several people in the crowd began to cry happy tears. Sarah stepped forward hesitantly. "Lieutenant, sir, I don't know how to thank you. This is the most incredible act of kindness I've ever witnessed." "Ma'am," Mitchell replied with a formal nod, "your husband made a mistake, but it's clear that Emma is loved and well cared for. Sometimes good people have bad moments, and sometimes those bad moments can lead to something better if we choose to see the opportunity." By now, word of the extraordinary scene had spread throughout the palace grounds. Other guards at nearby posts were subtly turning their heads to watch, though they maintained their positions. Palace officials were huddled in discussions, unsure how to handle this unprecedented situation. The story was already spreading on social media, with hashtags like #HeartGuard and #EmmaMeetsTheGuard trending. A reporter from the BBC who had been covering a different story nearby approached with her camera crew. "Lieutenant, if I may, could you tell us what led to this remarkable display of compassion?" Lieutenant Mitchell considered the question carefully. "Sometimes we get so focused on following rules that we forget the purpose behind them. Our job as the Queen's Guard is to protect and serve. Today, I believe we did exactly that." Officer Davies, who had initially been concerned about protocol violations, stepped forward with a smile. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I think what you've done here today represents the very best of what the Queen's Guard stands for. I'll be recommending you for a commendation for your exceptional handling of this situation." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only was he not being arrested, but the guard who had shown him such incredible mercy was now being praised for his actions. The guilt he felt for his earlier behavior was overwhelming, but it was mixed with profound gratitude and amazement. "Sir," Marcus said, addressing Lieutenant Mitchell, "I don't deserve this kindness, but I want you to know that this will change how I handle difficult situations for the rest of my life. Emma will grow up hearing about the day a royal guard showed her father what real strength and character look like." Lieutenant Mitchell smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his entire face. "Mr. Thompson, Emma will grow up knowing that even when her father made a mistake, He was man enough to face the consequences and learn from them. That's a valuable lesson for any child. The crowd had now grown to several hundred people, all drawn by the news of this extraordinary interaction. People were taking photos not just of the guard and the baby, but of Marcus and Sarah as well. Wanting to capture this family that had become part of an incredible story, Emma, seemingly aware that she was the center of attention, began making happy baby sounds and waving her tiny arms. Every movement delighted the crowd further. She had gone from being a crying, overheated baby to being the star of what was becoming a legendary moment in Royal Guard history. A palace official in a formal suit approached the group. Everyone tensed, wondering if this meant the end of the magical interlude. But instead of shutting down the situation, he carried with him an ornate envelope bearing the royal seal. "Lieutenant Mitchell," the official said formally, "Her Majesty has been informed of the situation. She has asked me to deliver this personal note to young Emma and her family." He handed the envelope to Sarah, who accepted it with trembling hands. The crowd fell completely silent as Sarah carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on palace stationery. With tears streaming down her face, she read it aloud. "To Emma Rose Thompson, welcome to London. Your visit has brought joy and reminded us all that compassion and understanding are the true foundations of service. With warm regards, Elizabeth Arta." The crowd erupted in the loudest cheer yet. People were crying, applauding, and taking countless photos. This had gone beyond anything anyone could have imagined, from a potential criminal incident to a personal note from the Queen herself. Within hours of the incident, the video footage had spread across social media platforms worldwide. The hashtag #HeartGuard was trending in 12 countries, and news outlets from America to Australia were picking up the story. But this wasn't just another viral video. It was touching hearts and changing perspectives in ways no one could have anticipated. Marcus and Sarah found themselves at the center of a media storm, but it was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Instead of criticism and condemnation, they were receiving messages of support and understanding from parents around the globe. Thousands of people were sharing their own stories of moments when they had lost their temper with their children, and how seeing Lieutenant Mitchell's response had inspired them to handle future situations differently. The family had been invited to stay at a nearby hotel as guests of the tourism board, who recognized the positive impact the story was having on London's reputation. In their room, Marcus sat on the bed holding Emma while Sarah read through some of the messages they had received on social media. "Listen to this one," Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's from a father in Australia. I saw your story today and it made me realize I've been too hard on my kids when they act up in public. Your Lieutenant Mitchell showed me that patience and understanding work so much better than anger. Thank you for sharing this moment with the world." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "I still can't believe that my worst moment became something that's helping other people." Emma was contentedly playing with the royal button that Lieutenant Mitchell had given her, the ribbon now permanently attached to her favorite blanket. She seemed completely unaware of the international sensation she had become, more interested in the way the polished metal caught the light from the hotel window. Back at Buckingham Palace, Lieutenant Mitchell was experiencing his own form of unexpected fame. Fellow guards who had served for decades were approaching him with congratulations, and his commanding officers were fielding calls from news organizations around the world requesting interviews. The palace press office had issued a statement praising his exemplary display of the values that the Queen's Guard represents. But for Lieutenant Mitchell, the real reward came from the letters that were beginning to arrive at the palace. Children from schools across Britain were sending drawings of him with baby Emma. Parents were writing to thank him for showing their kids what real strength looked like. Veterans were praising him for demonstrating that military discipline and human compassion could exist together. One letter that particularly moved him came from a young boy named Tommy in Liverpool. "Dear Guard Sir, my dad has a bad temper sometimes and it makes me scared. After he saw your video, he said he wants to be more like you. He hasn't yelled at me for 3 days. Thank you for helping my dad be nicer." The impact wasn't limited to individual families. Several parenting organizations had reached out to Marcus and Sarah, asking if they would be willing to share their story at conferences and workshops. The idea that a moment of poor judgment could be transformed into a teaching opportunity was revolutionary to many people working in child development and family counseling. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a child psychologist from Cambridge University, had written about the incident in her blog. "What we witnessed at Buckingham Palace wasn't just an act of individual kindness. It was a masterclass in de-escalation, empathy, and the power of choosing compassion over punishment." Lieutenant Mitchell's response turned a potentially traumatic experience for this family into a positive memory that will likely influence how they handle stress for generations to come. Meanwhile, the video had caught the attention of military organizations around the world. The incident was being studied in leadership courses as an example of how to handle unexpected situations with grace and wisdom. Several military academies had added the footage to their curriculum as a case study in making judgment calls under pressure. The royal button that Lieutenant Mitchell had given to Emma had sparked its own phenomena. Military collectors and historians were fascinated by the gesture, calling it unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard. the palace had announced they would not be disciplining Mitchell for removing the button, instead praising his innovation in creating a new tradition of connection with the public. 3 days after the incident, Marcus received a phone call that left him speechless. It was from Lieutenant Mitchell himself, calling during his off-duty hours to check on Emma and the family. "I wanted to make sure she was doing well after all the excitement," Mitchell said in his warm, off-duty voice that was so different from his formal guard demeanor, "and I wanted to tell you that your willingness to admit your mistake and learn from it has been inspiring to watch. You've handled this situation with real dignity." "Sir," Marcus replied, still somewhat in awe of receiving a personal call from the guard, "I have to ask, why did you do it? Why did you show me such kindness when you could have just had me arrested?" Lieutenant Mitchell was quiet for a moment before answering. "I grew up with a father who had a bad temper. He wasn't a bad man, just overwhelmed and stressed, working multiple jobs to support our family. I always wished someone had shown him a different way to handle his frustration, instead of just punishing him for it. When I saw you in that moment, I saw my father, and I saw an opportunity to be the person I wished had been there for him." The conversation lasted for over an hour, with Mitchell sharing stories about his own childhood and Marcus opening up about the pressures he faced as a working-class father trying to provide opportunities for his daughter. By the end of the call, they had formed a genuine friendship that would last for years to come. The ripple effects of their interaction continued to spread. A children's book publisher had approached Sarah about collaborating on a picture book about Emma's adventure with the Royal Guard. A toy company wanted to create a special edition Royal Guard figure, with proceeds going to charities, supporting military families and child development programs. Most importantly, the story had sparked conversations in families around the world about patience, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Parents were using the story to teach their children about making mistakes and learning from them, while also showing them that authority figures could be both strong and kind. 1 year later, Marcus and Sarah returned to London for Emma's first birthday, carrying with them a hand-painted thank you card that Emma had helped create by pressing her tiny painted handprints onto the paper. The media attention had died down, but the impact of that extraordinary day had continued to resonate in their lives and the lives of countless others who had heard their story. Emma was now walking, her chubby legs carrying her confidently around the same courtyard where her stroller had once been hurled in anger. She wore a tiny red dress that Sarah had made special for the occasion, and around her neck hung the royal button that Lieutenant Mitchell had given her, now polished to an even brighter shine by loving hands. Lieutenant Mitchell was waiting for them at the same post, where they had first met, though this time he was off duty and wearing civilian clothes. The formal, imposing figure that tourists usually saw had been replaced by a warm, smiling young man who immediately dropped to his knees when he saw Emma toddling toward him. "Happy birthday, Emma," he said, opening his arms as she ran straight to him without hesitation. She had no memory of their dramatic first meeting, but somehow she remembered his kindness, his gentle voice, and the safety she had felt in his presence that overwhelming day. Marcus watched with tears in his eyes as his daughter hugged the man who had changed their lives with a single act of compassion. Over the past year, Marcus had indeed become a different father. The patience and understanding that Lieutenant Mitchell had shown him had become a model for how he handled stressful situations with Emma and in every other area of his life. "She's grown so much," Mitchell observed as Emma showed him her new walking skills, taking proud steps back and forth between her parents and her special friend. "We all have," Sarah replied meaningfully. She handed him the handmade card and a small wrapped gift. "This is from our family to yours, James. We wanted you to know that not a single day has passed without us being grateful for what you did." Lieutenant Mitchell opened the gift carefully, revealing a small framed photograph of Emma playing with building blocks, constructing what looked like a tiny palace. Attached was a note in Marcus's handwriting. "She's building her own kingdom now, one where kindness rules. Thank you for showing us the way." The impact of their story had continued to spread far beyond what any of them could have imagined. The children's book that Sarah had co-authored, titled Emma and the Kind Guard, had become an international bestseller, with translations in 15 languages. All proceeds were donated to programs supporting military, families, and parenting resources for working-class families. The book had become required reading in many elementary schools, used to teach children about empathy, forgiveness, and how to turn mistakes into learning opportunities. Teachers reported that playground conflicts were being resolved differently, with children asking what would the Kind Guard do when faced with situations where they could choose punishment or understanding. Military training programs around the world had incorporated the Mitchell method into their curriculum, a approach to conflict resolution that emphasized de-escalation through compassion while maintaining authority and safety. Lieutenant Mitchell had been invited to speak at leadership conferences, sharing how his split-second decision to choose empathy over protocol had created positive ripple effects he never could have anticipated. Marcus had started volunteering with a local parenting support group, sharing his story with other fathers who struggled with anger and frustration. His construction company had promoted him to project manager, partly because of the leadership qualities and emotional intelligence he had developed since that transformative day at the palace. "You know, Marcus said as they watched Emma play with a toy soldier that Mitchell had brought for her. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't thrown that stroller. Would we have just taken a few photos and gone home, and never learned any of these lessons? Mitchell considered this thoughtfully. I think the lessons were already inside you, Marcus. The moment just created the opportunity for them to come out. You could have reacted to my response with more anger, or dismissed it as just a guard doing his job. But you chose to really hear what was happening, and let it change you. That choice was yours, not mine. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the palace grounds, other tourists began to recognize the small group. Word had spread that the famous Stroller family and the Heart Guard were reuniting, and people started gathering at a respectful distance. Many of them sharing their own stories of how the viral video had impacted their lives. An elderly woman approached hesitantly, carrying a young grandson who couldn't have been much older than Emma. "Excuse me," she said to Mitchell, "but I wanted to thank you. After I saw your story last year, I changed how I handled my grandson's tantrums. Instead of getting frustrated, I started getting down on his level and talking to him calmly. It's made such a difference in our relationship." Similar conversations continued throughout the evening. Parents, grandparents, teachers, and even other military personnel shared stories of how that single moment of choosing compassion over punishment had influenced their own decisions in difficult situations. As the family prepared to leave, Lieutenant Mitchell handed Emma a small envelope. "This is for when she's older," he told Sarah. "It's a letter explaining what really happened that day, and why her father's willingness to learn from a mistake made him a hero in my eyes." Marcus shook his head. "James, you're the hero in this story. I'm just a man who learned to be better because someone believed I could be." "That's exactly what makes you heroic," Mitchell replied. "Anyone can make a mistake. Not everyone has the courage to let that mistake teach them something important." Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand the full story of her first visit to London, she would treasure that letter. But more importantly, she would grow up in a home where patience was valued over anger, where mistakes were seen as learning opportunities, and where the memory of a royal guard's kindness reminded her family daily that choosing compassion could change the world, one interaction at a time. The story of the angry father and the kind guard had become more than just a viral moment. It had become a testament to the power of human decency, second chances, and the extraordinary things that can happen when someone chooses to respond to anger with understanding. In a world often filled with harsh judgment and quick punishment, Lieutenant Mitchell's decision to see past Marcus's worst moment to his best intentions had created a ripple effect of kindness that continued to spread, touching lives and changing hearts around the globe. Emma kept that royal button with her always, and whenever she faced difficult situations in her own life, she would touch it and remember the story of how one man's compassion had turned her father's worst day into the beginning of their family's best chapter. The lesson was simple but powerful. Sometimes the most extraordinary acts of heroism come not from following rules, but from knowing when to break them in service of something greater: human understanding, forgiveness, and love.